It really has been such a confusing part of this pandemic. People who show symptoms of COVID, some even hospitalized, still testing negative.
Yeah, that happened quite a bit. And there have been problems with not only false negative results, but also false positives. Chris Pickle investigates bad tests and how they got on the market in the first place.
It's important to note that at the beginning of the pandemic, there were no treatments or products to deal with COVID-19. It's a new virus. But in the rush to make tests available, no one had to prove they were accurate.
Initially, it really just felt like a quick onset of a significant flu. Soreness, achiness, fatigue, spiking fevers, just really feeling cruddy.
Knocked off his game. As the pandemic was about to hit the U.S., an illness hit Brian Court. After recovering from what he thought was the flu, a few weeks later, he ended up in the hospital. You couldn't breathe.
I was frightened. It was a scary feeling.
Brian tested negative for the flu, and after months of ongoing issues, Brian realized he probably had coronavirus, which meant he would have antibodies. Did you ever take a test?
I did, and my test came back negative.
Were you surprised when the test came back negative?
I was. It sure seems like my experience mirrors that of many people who've described their experience and been diagnosed with COVID.
Testing is an important weapon in the fight against the pandemic, but a year and a half in, reliability with tests remains an issue.
The worst thing was when people were told you're not sick, and they went to visit relatives, they went to work, they went shopping, they went out in the world, and they were spreading the disease, not meaning to.
Dr. Diana Zuckerman is president of the National Center for Health Research, an independent think tank focused on public health. She wrote an article highlighting the fact hundreds of medical products used during the pandemic, including vaccines, tests, treatments, and personal protective equipment, were rushed to market. Instead of these products getting FDA approval, which requires extensive research and clinical trials to show safety and effectiveness, the FDA is using emergency use authorizations, known as EUAs, which requires a product's benefits outweigh the risks, a significantly lower standard.
There's a very substantial difference between the emergency use authorization and FDA approval.
In February of 2020, at the pandemic's beginning, the FDA used those lower standards for tests to diagnose COVID-19. Labs could put tests on the market, then apply for an EUA within 3 weeks, allowing tests to be sold the FDA had not reviewed.
They had a huge backlog, so months were going by when those test results weren't being vetted by the FDA, but the diagnostic test was being used widely. And
then in March, the FDA allowed antibody tests on the market, which detect if someone has had COVID. There were no EUA requirements. Manufacturers just couldn't claim the test could be used for a diagnosis.
They shouldn't claim that this is an accurate way of finding out if you had COVID before. It's kind of silly, because otherwise, what's the point of taking the test?
Unreliable tests flooded the market. In response, in May, the FDA updated its policy, also requiring EUAs for antibody tests, and acknowledged that while the agency was trying to be flexible in responding to the public health emergency, unscrupulous actors were marketing fraudulent test kits, taking advantage of Americans' anxiety and falsely claiming tests were FDA approved. Why would they allow tests to even go on the market that they hadn't vetted?
The most logical explanation is they were desperate. There was enormous amounts of pressure to have tests on the market.
The FDA website now lists 19 diagnostic and 267 antibody tests that should no longer be used. I counted 360 tests that have been given EUAs, but another 300 tests the FDA has not reviewed yet, even though they may be on the market. And not all tests are created equal. We compared 2 tests, both with EUAs, and found one was 3,000 times more sensitive in detecting COVID than the other.
So is there any way for people to know if the tests they took were accurate?
Not really. I mean, certainly there's no easy way. The best way to know whether your test is accurate is to get a second test.
Out of the hundreds of tests, only one test has passed all the hurdles that would have been needed to get on the market prior to the pandemic. Chris Pickle, Arizona's Family.